The banging on my front door jolted me awake from a deep sleep. I squinted at the clock beside my bed. 4:03 a.m. on a Saturday morning. My heart raced as the pounding continued, insistent and aggressive. Who could possibly need me at this ungodly hour? Was there an emergency? A fire? I stumbled out of bed, disoriented and half asleep. The knocking grew more intense as I made my way downstairs. I flipped on the porch light and peered through the peephole. A woman stood there, arms crossed tightly over her chest, foot tapping impatiently on my welcome mat. It took me a moment to recognize her, Karen Thompson from 3 houses down. We had exchanged maybe 10 words total since I moved in 6 months ago. What could she possibly want at this hour? I opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock fastened. The cold night air rushed in as Karen's face came into full view. Her expression was a mixture of impatience and entitlement that immediately set me on edge. "Finally," she huffed, as if I had kept her waiting for hours rather than seconds. "I need you to move your Jeep right now." I blinked at her, certain I had misheard. "Excuse me." "Your Jeep," she repeated slowly, as if talking to a child. "I need you to move it out of your driveway immediately. My dinner party guests cannot find parking on the street, and I told them they could use your driveway since you never have visitors anyway." I stood there, momentarily speechless. Was this some kind of bizarre dream? Karen had not only woken me up at 4 in the morning, but was demanding I vacate my own private property for guests of a party I had not even been invited to. "I am sorry, but that is my private driveway," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured despite the absurdity of the situation. "I am not moving my vehicle." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Do you realize who I am? I have lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. You cannot just refuse to help a neighbor in need." "It is 4 in the morning," I replied, my patience wearing thin. "And that is my property. My answer is no." Her face flushed red, and her voice rose several octaves. "This neighborhood works because people cooperate. If you cannot be a team player, perhaps you should reconsider living here." "Good night, Karen," I said firmly, beginning to close the door. She thrust her foot forward, preventing the door from closing completely. "If you do not move that Jeep in the next 5 minutes, I am going to make a call that you will regret." I stared at her, stunned by the explicit threat. "Are you threatening me over a parking space?" "5 minutes," she repeated, removing her foot and taking a step back. "Your choice." I closed the door, locked it, and stood in my darkened entryway for several moments, processing what had just happened. Surely she was bluffing. No rational person would escalate a parking dispute to any authorities, especially not at this hour. I decided to return to bed, chalking the encounter up to dealing with an entitled neighbor who would eventually back down. 20 minutes later, I was drifting back to sleep when a new sound pulled me back to consciousness, sirens growing louder by the second. I sat up in bed, a cold feeling of dread spreading through my chest. She would not have, would she? I moved to my bedroom window and pulled back the curtain. Red and blue lights pulsed through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the houses, the entire street in alternating crimson and sapphire flashes. I watched in disbelief as a police cruiser pulled up directly in front of my house. This could not be happening. I threw on a t-shirt and rushed downstairs, my mind racing. What exactly had she told them to warrant a police response? As I reached for the door handle, I paused, taking a deep breath to compose myself. Whatever was happening, I needed to remain calm and rational. I stepped outside into the cool night air. 2 officers stood at the foot of my driveway, flashlights in hand. Karen stood nearby, her arms folded across her chest, a satisfied expression on her face. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes, curious about the commotion. I walked down my front path, heart pounding in my chest. The officers turned their attention to me, expressions unreadable in the harsh, contrasting light. "Good evening, sir," one of them said, his hand resting casually near his holster. We received a call about a disturbance at this address. I looked past him to Karen, who was watching the scene unfold with an unmistakable smirk. The simple refusal to move my car had somehow morphed into something much more sinister. And standing there, barefoot on my own property with police officers questioning me like I was the criminal, I knew this was only the beginning of my troubles with Karen. "Sir, we received a report of aggressive behavior and blocking emergency access," the officer continued, his tone professional but stern. "Can you explain what is going on here?" I felt a surge of indignation rise within me. Emergency access. That was a blatant lie. I glanced at Karen, who was now making a show of looking concerned and frightened, as if I were some dangerous threat that needed to be contained. "Officer," I began, keeping my voice steady despite my building anger, "there has been a misunderstanding. This woman knocked on my door at 4 in the morning demanding I move my Jeep from my own driveway so her dinner party guests could park there. I refused, which is my right, and she threatened to make a call. Apparently, this is what she meant." The second officer, a younger man with a skeptical expression, looked toward Karen. "Ma'am, is this accurate?" Karen stepped forward, putting on what I could only describe as a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Not at all." I politely asked if he could help with a parking situation, and he became immediately hostile. He threatened me and refused to move his vehicle, which is blocking potential emergency access. I feared for my safety. "That is absolutely false," I interjected, my composure slipping slightly. "I never threatened anyone, and my Jeep is parked in my own driveway, not blocking any access." More neighbors had gathered now, some still in their pajamas, others fully dressed as if they had never gone to bed. I could see phones pointed in our direction, recording the spectacle. My private dispute had become public entertainment, and I was being cast as the villain. "Do you have documentation that this is your property?" the first officer asked. "Yes, of course I do. It is my house. Let me get my paperwork." I returned inside, my hands trembling slightly with adrenaline and anger as I retrieved my property documents from my home office. When I returned outside, the crowd had grown. I could hear whispers, see pointing fingers. Karen was speaking animatedly to a small group, no doubt continuing to spread her false narrative. I handed the papers to the officers, pointing out the property lines clearly marked on the documents. "As you can see, the driveway is entirely on my property. I have every right to park there and refuse access to others." The officers reviewed the paperwork, exchanging glances. The older one nodded slightly. "Sir, this does appear to be your private property," he acknowledged. "However, we still received a call about a disturbance." The only disturbance was this woman pounding on my door at 4 in the morning, and then calling you when I would not comply with her unreasonable demand, I said, my frustration evident in my voice. Karen stepped forward again, her voice loud enough for all the gathered neighbors to hear. "He is twisting everything. Ask anyone here about his attitude since moving in. He has been nothing but trouble." I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, people I had barely interacted with since moving in. Most avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others watched with undisguised curiosity. I realized with a sinking feeling that they were not seeing the full picture. They were seeing a new resident causing problems for a long-established neighbor. After what felt like an eternity, the officers seemed to reach a conclusion. "This appears to be a civil matter," the older officer stated, putting away his notepad. "Sir, you have the right to control access to your private property. Ma'am, in the future, please do not call emergency services for non-emergency situations like this." No apology. No acknowledgement of the unnecessary humiliation I had just endured. Just a clinical assessment and a mild admonishment that did nothing to undo the damage to my reputation. The officers returned to their vehicle while Karen stood her ground, still playing the victim for her gathered audience. As the police cruiser pulled away, she turned to me, her voice low but perfectly audible. "You should learn how things work around here," she said, the threat evident in her tone. "This neighborhood has standards." I watched as she walked away, immediately surrounded by sympathetic neighbors. I stood alone on my lawn, acutely aware of the whispers and stares directed my way. The night air felt colder now, the exposure more acute. I retreated into my house, locking the door behind me. Sleep was impossible now. I paced my living room, replaying the events over and over in my mind. What had just happened was more than a simple dispute. It was a public shamming, a power play designed to put me in my place. Karen had manufactured a crisis, called the authorities, and painted me as a threatening neighbor, all because I refused to let her party guests use my driveway. I looked out my window at the now quiet street. The neighbors had returned to their homes, the excitement over for now, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. I was no longer just the new guy on the block. I was now the troublemaker, the difficult one, the obstacle to neighborhood harmony, and all because of one woman's wounded pride and entitlement. As dawn broke over the houses, I made myself a strong cup of coffee, my mind already formulating what would come next. This was not over. Karen had fired the first shot in what would become a neighborhood war, one I had never asked for, but now found myself drafted into. And unbeknownst to her, she had made a critical error. She had underestimated my resolve. By Monday morning, the aftermath of the late-night confrontation had evolved into something far more insidious. I woke up to a notification on my phone, a new post in the neighborhood Facebook group. I had joined the group when I first moved in, hoping to connect with neighbors and learn about local events. Instead, it had become the battlefield for Karen's character assassination campaign. The post, authored by Karen herself, did not mention me by name, but the implication was crystal clear. Neighbors need to be warned about aggressive and unstable individuals in our community who refuse to cooperate with long-standing residents and create hostile environments. If anyone else has had concerning encounters with certain new homeowners, please message me privately. We need to ensure our neighborhood remains safe for everyone. The comments section had exploded with concerned responses, vague expressions of support, and curiosity about who this dangerous element might be. Karen responding to each comment with just enough information to point fingers without explicitly nomming me. It was masterfully manipulative. I scrolled through the comments, my stomach tightening with each sympathetic response to Karen. One neighbor wrote, "I heard the police were called this weekend. Was that related?" Karen's response, "Unfortunately, yes. Sometimes authorities need to be involved when someone becomes threatening." I set my phone down, taking a deep breath to control my growing anger. This was defamation, plain and simple, but confronting her directly on the platform would only feed into her narrative of me as aggressive and unstable. As I prepared for work, my email notification chimed. The subject line read, "Notice of Violation, Neighborhood Association." I opened it with growing dread. "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that there have been noise complaints registered against your property. Specifically, loud disturbances during quiet hours 10 p.m., 7 a.m. As per the HOA Bylaws Section 4.3, such disturbances constitute a violation. This is your first official warning. Continued violations may result in fines or other actions as permitted by the association rules. Sincerely, HOA Board." Noise complaints. I lived alone and was generally quiet, especially during nighttime hours. The only noise had been Karen pounding on my door at 4 in the morning. This was beyond absurd. It was targeted harassment using the HOA as a weapon. I drafted a careful response, explaining the situation and requesting information about the specific complaints, including dates and times. I attached my doorbell camera footage of Karen's late-night visit as evidence of who was actually creating disturbances during quiet hours. Before I could hit send, another email arrived. This one was about improper waste disposal, another violation I had supposedly committed. I had always been meticulous about following the community guidelines for trash and recycling. What was happening? As I left for work, I found a paper letter in my mailbox. Unlike the emails, this one had no official HOA letterhead, just a plain typed note. Your disruptive behavior and attitude are not welcome in this community. Either learn to be a good neighbor or consider moving elsewhere. I looked up and down the street, half expecting to see someone watching me read the anonymous threat. The neighborhood seemed peaceful in the morning light, betraying none of the hostility that was being directed at me behind the scenes. Throughout the day, I received notification after notification from the neighborhood Facebook group. Each time I checked, I found more veiled references to me as a problem resident. When I attempted to post a calm, factual response about what had actually happened, my comment mysteriously disappeared within minutes. I tried again, with the same result. Somehow, my voice was being systematically silenced. That evening, I noticed a small gathering of neighbors on Karen's front lawn. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward my house. The whisper campaign was moving from online to in person. I was being discussed, judged, and condemned without any opportunity to defend myself. I tried one more time to post on the Facebook group, this time taking screenshots before and after to document what was happening. As I suspected, my comment was deleted within minutes. How was she doing this? Why did she have so much control over neighborhood communications? The answer came in the form of an automatically generated email that arrived moments later. Your post has been removed by Group Administrator Karen Thompson for violating community guidelines. Karen was not just a neighbor or a random HOA member. She was an administrator of the Facebook group and possibly more. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my computer screen as the pieces fell into place. This was not just about a parking space or a wounded ego. Karen wielded actual power in this community, and she was using every tool at her disposal to isolate and pressure me. The late-night confrontation had merely been the opening salvo in what was clearly a coordinated campaign to either force me to submit to her authority or drive me out of the neighborhood entirely. I closed my laptop and walked to my front window, looking out at the peaceful street that now felt anything but welcoming. Karen had declared war, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. If she wanted to play this game, she would soon discover that I had no intention of surrendering. In fact, I was just getting started. The next morning, I woke up with a clear mission. If Karen was going to use her position of power to target me, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against and gather evidence that could not be deleted or dismissed. This was no longer about defending myself. It was about exposing the truth. My first step was to secure and organize the evidence I already had. I downloaded the footage from my doorbell camera showing Karen's 4 a.m. visit and the subsequent police arrival. I saved screenshots of her Facebook posts, the mysteriously disappearing comments, and the emails from the HOA about violations that never occurred. But I knew this was just the surface. I decided to research the HOA itself. Who exactly was on the board? What powers did they have? And most importantly, what was Karen's official role? I navigated to the Neighborhood Association website and clicked on the board members section. There she was, listed prominently. Karen Thompson, Vice President of Community Standards and Communications. This explained so much: her control over the Facebook group, her ability to issue violation notices, her influence with other residents. She was not just a nosy neighbor. She held an official position that gave her legitimate authority over community matters. But was she abusing that authority? I needed to find out. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the HOA bylaws and meeting minutes from the past year. The documents revealed a pattern. Residents who crossed Karen mysteriously found themselves targeted with multiple violation notices. Properties that Karen had disputes with suddenly became subject to special reviews by the board. Her power was not just perceived, it was documented in black and white. But I needed more. I needed to speak with others who had experienced what I was going through. I remembered a couple who had lived across the street when I first moved in, the Andersons. They had abruptly sold their house and moved away about 3 months ago. At the time, I had thought nothing of it, but now I wondered if there might be more to the story. Through some social media searching, I found Robert Anderson's professional profile and sent him a message explaining my situation briefly and asking if they would be willing to share their experience in the neighborhood. To my surprise, he responded within hours. "We have been waiting for someone to reach out," his message read. "What you are experiencing is exactly why we left. Call us. We have documentation you might find interesting." That evening, I spoke with the Andersons via video call. Their story was chillingly similar to mine. It had started with a minor dispute over their front yard landscaping. Karen had objected to their choice of native plants instead of the standard grass lawn. When they refused to change their eco-friendly garden, the harassment began: violation notices, public shamming, removal from neighborhood communications. "We fought it for almost a year," Robert explained, his face grim on my computer screen. "But when our children started being excluded from neighborhood activities, we decided it was not worth it. We sold at a loss just to escape." His wife, Linda, nodded solemnly beside him. "We should have fought harder, gathered evidence like you are doing. We have emails, text messages, and even recorded phone calls that show how she operates. We will send everything to you." By the next morning, my inbox contained dozens of files from the Andersons, a treasure trove of evidence showing Karen's pattern of targeted harassment. One recorded phone call was particularly damning. Karen explicitly telling the Andersons that she would make life difficult for them until they learned to comply with community standards. Armed with this new information, I reached out to other former residents who had moved away under similar circumstances. Each conversation revealed the same pattern: minor disputes escalated by Karen's abuse of power, followed by coordinated pressure campaigns until the residents gave in or moved away. One former neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Chen, sent me copies of emails where Karen had made thinly veiled racist comments about his cultural decorations during Lunar New Year. Another shared screenshots of a private HOA meeting where Karen had referred to a single mother as a problem resident who lowered property values with her lifestyle. The picture emerging was clear. Karen was not just an entitled neighbor but a neighborhood tyrant who had systematically bullied anyone who challenged her authority or did not fit her vision of what the community should be. And she had been doing it for years, unchecked and unchallenged. I organized everything into a comprehensive digital folder, meticulously labeled and categorized. Dates, times, incidents, patterns of behavior, all documented with supporting evidence. I included my own experiences as well, creating a timeline that showed the escalation from the driveway incident to the current smear campaign. As I reviewed the mounting evidence, I realized I had compiled something powerful, not just a defense for myself, but a case against Karen that revealed a years-long pattern of abuse, discrimination, and misuse of HOA authority. This was no longer about my driveway or my Jeep. This was about justice for every resident who had been bullied, marginalized, or driven away. I sat back in my chair, looking at the organized files on my computer screen. Karen had made a critical error in targeting me. She had chosen someone who would not back down, who had the skills and determination to expose her. She had no idea what was coming. I carefully backed up all the files to multiple secure locations. Then I began drafting a formal complaint to the HOA board, not just about my individual case, but about the systematic abuse of power that had been occurring under their watch. This would not be an emotional plea but a factual, evidence-based case that could not be ignored or dismissed. Karen had started this war thinking I would be an easy target, another resident to bully into submission. She was about to discover how wrong she was. The truth was my weapon, and I was ready to use it. With my evidence compiled and organized, it was time to begin my counteroffensive. I knew that taking on Karen would not be easy. She had years of established influence and a network of supporters in the neighborhood. But what she did not have was the truth, meticulously documented and irrefutable. My first step was to draft a formal complaint to the HOA board. This would not be a simple grievance, but a comprehensive report detailing Karen's pattern of harassment, abuse of power, and violation of HOA bylaws regarding fair treatment of residents. I included timestamps, quotes, documentation, and testimonials from both current and former neighbors. Crucially, I addressed the letter not just to the board but to every homeowner in the association, with copies marked for the regional HOA Oversight Committee and a property rights attorney I had consulted. This would prevent the complaint from being quietly buried or dismissed. As homeowners and members of this community, I wrote in the conclusion, we all have the right to fair treatment, transparent governance, and freedom from harassment. The documented actions of board member Karen Thompson represent not just violations of HOA bylaws, but potentially legal infractions regarding harassment, defamation, and abuse of authority. I respectfully request an immediate investigation and appropriate action. I sent the complaint via certified mail to ensure it could not be denied or ignored. Then I took a more direct approach with Karen herself. I drafted a cease and desist letter, formally warning her that her actions constituted harassment and defamation, with potential legal consequences if they continued. This letter serves as formal notice that your statements about me in public forums, unauthorized violation notices, and coordination of social isolation tactics constitute documented harassment and defamation, I wrote. I have compiled extensive evidence of these actions and their pattern. I request that you immediately cease all such activities. Failure to do so may result in legal action. This letter, too, was sent via certified mail, requiring her signature upon delivery. I wanted her to know that I was not intimidated, that I was documenting everything, and that I was prepared to escalate if necessary. My next step was more public. I uploaded the doorbell camera footage of Karen's 4 a.m. visit and the subsequent police call to a popular HOA accountability forum. I was careful to present just the facts, the timestamps showing the early hour, Karen's demand to use my private property, and her disproportionate response when refused. I did not editorialize or attack her character. The video spoke for itself. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments poured in from across the country, many from people who had experienced similar HOA overreach. But more importantly, local neighbors began to reach out privately. Some offered support. Others shared their own stories of intimidation by Karen. Most significantly, several board members contacted me to express concern about what they had seen. I had no idea this was happening, one board member wrote in a private email. Many of the violation notices and complaints you mentioned were never brought to the full board for review. They were handled unilaterally by the Community Standards Committee, which is essentially just Karen. Karen's response was telling silence. No more Facebook posts about problem neighbors. No more violation notices in my mailbox. No more whisper campaigns on her front lawn. She had retreated, hoping perhaps that the storm would blow over. But it was too late for that. 3 days after my complaint was delivered, I received an official email from the HOA president. Dear homeowner, we have received your formal complaint regarding board member Karen Thompson and the serious allegations contained therein. After preliminary review of the evidence provided, the board has voted to call an emergency meeting this Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center to address these concerns. You are formally invited to present your case directly to the board and attending homeowners. Board member Thompson will be given equal time to respond. We take these allegations very seriously and are committed to ensuring our HOA operates with fairness and transparency. I read the email twice, hardly believing the rapid response. The tide was turning. Karen's carefully constructed position of authority was beginning to crumble under the weight of evidence and truth. For the first time since the late-night confrontation, I felt a sense of relief and vindication. That feeling was reinforced later that evening when my doorbell rang. This time, it was not Karen but my next-door neighbor, Michael, whom I had barely spoken with before. "I saw the video," he said simply, "and I want you to know that many of us are on your side. We have just been too afraid to speak up until now, but we will be at that meeting on Thursday, all of us." As he walked away, I noticed several other neighbors had emerged from their homes, nodding at me in silent support. The isolation Karen had engineered was breaking down. The truth was spreading, and with it, courage was growing among those who had stayed silent. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the meeting, organizing my evidence into a clear, compelling presentation. I was not interested in revenge or public humiliation. My goal was justice, not just for myself, but for every resident who had been bullied, marginalized, or forced out of their home by Karen's reign of HOA terror. Thursday night would be a reckoning. Karen had knocked on my door at 4 a.m. demanding I move my Jeep. Now I was knocking on the door of her power structure, and unlike her demand, mine was backed by truth, justice, and the support of the very community she claimed to protect. Thursday evening arrived with a tension that hung in the air like an approaching storm. I walked toward the community center, case file tucked under my arm, stomach tight with anticipation. As I approached the building, I was stunned by what I saw. The parking lot was full, and residents continued to stream through the doors. This was no ordinary HOA meeting with the usual sparse attendance. Word had spread, and the community had shown up in force. Inside, the room buzzed with hushed conversations that fell silent as I entered. I recognized faces I had never spoken to, neighbors who had previously averted their eyes when passing my house. Now they offered small nods, subtle gestures of acknowledgement and support. I took a seat in the front row, my heart pounding against my ribs. At the long table facing the audience sat the 5 HOA board members. Karen was among them, her posture rigid, face carefully composed into a mask of professional indifference. She did not look at me directly, but I could feel her awareness of my presence like a physical force. The HOA president, a silver-haired man named Walter, called the meeting to order precisely at 7. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat. "We have called this emergency session to address serious allegations regarding the conduct of a board member," he announced, his voice solemn. "As this is both a sensitive and significant matter, we will proceed with careful adherence to our bylaws regarding complaints and investigations." He outlined the format. I would present my case first, followed by Karen's response, then questions from the board and, time permitting, from residents. Each side would have 20 minutes. "Mr. Grant, you have the floor," Walter said, gesturing toward the podium. I approached slowly, setting my materials down and taking a deep breath to steady myself. I had practiced this moment countless times, but facing the actual room of neighbors and board members, with Karen watching my every move, was more intimidating than I had anticipated. "Thank you for the opportunity to address the board and my fellow neighbors," I began, my voice gaining strength with each word. "I am not here out of personal vendetta or pettiness. I am here because what has happened to me has happened to many others in this community, and it represents a fundamental violation of the trust and authority placed in HOA leadership." I proceeded methodically, starting with the 4 a.m. incident. I played the doorbell camera footage on the projection screen, the timestamp clearly visible as Karen demanded I move my Jeep. The room remained silent, but I could feel the collective intake of breath as they witnessed her escalating demands and threats. This was my introduction to how power is wielded in our community, I continued. Not through proper channels or reasonable requests, but through intimidation and disproportionate responses. I moved through the evidence chronologically: the police call, the false claims of emergency access blockage, the Facebook posts where Karen had labeled me unstable and dangerous, the mysteriously appearing violation notices for infractions that never occurred. With each piece of evidence, I provided documentation, screenshots, emails, official notices. Then I broadened the scope, showing that my experience was not unique. I shared testimonials from former residents, emails from the Andersons, recordings where Karen explicitly stated her intention to make life difficult for those who did not comply with her personal vision for the neighborhood. This is not about a parking dispute, I emphasized. This is about a pattern of targeted harassment and abuse of authority that has been ongoing for years. Residents have been bullied into compliance, publicly humiliated, and in some cases, driven from their homes entirely. Throughout my presentation, Karen remained stoic, though I noticed her hands gripping each other more tightly as the evidence mounted. The other board members' expressions shifted from neutral to concerned, some exchanging glances as particularly damning evidence was presented. As I approached my conclusion, I looked directly at the board. I'm not asking for punitive measures or personal vengeance. I am asking for accountability, transparency, and reform to ensure that HOA authority is never again abused in this way. Every homeowner deserves fair treatment and due process, not targeted campaigns of intimidation. Thank you. I returned to my seat amid complete silence. The weight of the evidence hung in the air, almost palpable in its impact. Walter cleared his throat again. Ms. Thompson, you have 20 minutes to respond to these allegations. Karen rose with practiced composure, smoothing her blouse as she approached the podium. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her voice, when she spoke, had a slight tremor beneath its controlled surface. What you have witnessed tonight is a carefully crafted narrative designed to discredit me and undermine the standards this community has maintained for 15 years, she began. Mr. Grant has taken isolated incidents, removed them from context, and woven them into a false pattern. She attempted to reframe each piece of evidence. The late-night visit was an urgent community matter. The police call was due to genuine concern. The violation notices were standard procedure applied equally to all residents. But with each explanation, the contradictions in her story became more apparent, especially when compared to the clear documentation I had presented. As for these alleged testimonials, she continued, her voice rising slightly, they are from disgruntled former residents who refuse to maintain community standards and are now seeking to blame others for their own failures to comply. At this point, something unexpected happened. A woman in the back of the room stood up. I recognized her as Mrs. Patel from down the street, a quiet resident who rarely attended community events. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm despite her nervous expression. "I would like to speak." Walter looked uncomfortable but nodded. We had planned for questions after both presentations, but— "This is not a question," Mrs. Patel interrupted. "It is a statement. I have lived here for 7 years, and I have never spoken at a meeting because I was afraid of becoming a target just like the others, but I cannot stay silent anymore." She turned to face Karen directly. 3 years ago, you threatened to fine me because my spices were creating offensive odors when I cooked traditional food. You said my cooking was lowering property values. You made me feel ashamed of my culture in my own home. Her words broke something in the room, a dam of silence that had held back similar stories for years. Another resident stood up, then another. One by one, neighbors began to share their experiences, small acts of intimidation, threats, selective enforcement of rules, public humiliation. Karen's carefully maintained composure cracked. This is absurd. This meeting is about one specific complaint, not a public forum for airing grievances. On the contrary, Walter interjected, his expression grave. This meeting is about the conduct of a board member and whether that conduct reflects the values and bylaws of our association. These testimonials are directly relevant. For nearly 30 minutes, the stories continued. Some were minor, Karen measuring grass height with a ruler on some lawns, but not others. Others were serious, Karen entering backyards without permission to document violations, calling employers to complain about residents who opposed her initiatives. With each account, Karen's support in the room visibly eroded, even among those who had once been her allies. When the last resident finished speaking, Walter called for a brief recess to allow the board to confer. Karen sat alone at one end of the board table, no one approaching her during the break. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically from when the meeting began. The fear was gone, replaced by a collective resolve that was almost tangible. After 15 minutes, the board members returned to their seats. Walter addressed the room with renewed authority in his voice. Based on the evidence presented and the testimonials heard tonight, the board has voted unanimously to take the following actions. First, Ms. Thompson is immediately suspended from all HOA duties pending a full investigation. Second, an independent auditor will review all violation notices, fines, and board decisions from the past 3 years to identify any patterns of selective. Based on the evidence presented and the testimonials heard tonight, the board has voted unanimously to take the following actions. First, Ms. Thompson is immediately suspended from all HOA duties pending a full investigation. Second, an independent auditor will review all violation notices, fines, and board decisions from the past 3 years to identify any patterns of selective enforcement or abuse of authority. Third, we will establish a new ethics committee comprised of rotating resident volunteers to oversee board actions and ensure transparency moving forward. The room erupted in applause and murmurs of approval. Karen's face flushed deep red as she stood abruptly. This is preposterous. I have given 15 years of service to this community. Everything I have done has been for the betterment of our neighborhood and property values. You cannot possibly believe the words of these malcontents over a board member with my record of dedication. Walter remained calm but firm. Karen, the evidence speaks for itself. This is not a punishment but a necessary step to restore trust in the board and our processes. You will have full opportunity to respond during the investigation. I will not be subjected to this witch hunt, Karen spat, gathering her belongings with trembling hands. You have no idea what you are doing. This neighborhood will fall apart without proper oversight. As she moved toward the exit, her gaze locked with mine for a brief moment. The hatred in her eyes was undisguised, raw and personal, but beneath it I saw something else: fear. The realization that her carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling around her. The door slammed behind her with a finality that seemed to punctuate the end of an era. The tension in the room visibly dissipated, replaced by a buzz of conversation and, remarkably, laughter. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged each other were now introducing themselves, exchanging stories, connecting over their shared experiences. Walter approached me as the meeting began to disperse. "I want to thank you," he said quietly. "Many of us on the board suspected problems, but we never had enough concrete evidence to act. What you did took courage." "It should not have taken courage to expect fair treatment in my own neighborhood," I replied. "But thank you for listening and taking action." As I prepared to leave, I found myself surrounded by neighbors, some offering handshakes, others quiet words of gratitude. Michael, my next-door neighbor, clapped me on the shoulder. "That was something else," he said with a smile. You know, Karen once tried to fine me for having my garbage cans out 10 minutes past the allowed time. She actually stood on the sidewalk with a stopwatch. An elderly woman I had never spoken to squeezed my hand. My late husband and I were planning to move because of her. After he passed, I could not bear to leave our home, but living here became so difficult. Thank you for giving us our neighborhood back. I walked home that night under a sky full of stars, feeling a weight lifted that I had not even fully recognized was there. The street looked different somehow, not just a collection of houses, but a community that might actually become home. As I approached my driveway, I looked at my Jeep parked exactly where it had been the night Karen pounded on my door. It stood as a symbol now, not just of private property rights, but of standing firm against bullying and injustice. I had not simply defended my right to park in my own driveway. I had helped restore balance and fairness to an entire community. The battle had been unexpectedly public and far larger than I had anticipated when I first refused Karen's 4 a.m. demand. But the outcome was more satisfying than I could have imagined. Justice had been served, not through shouting matches or petty revenge, but through truth, evidence, and the courage of an entire neighborhood to finally speak up. I unlocked my front door feeling truly at home for the first time since moving in. Whatever came next would be built on a foundation of fairness and mutual respect, not fear and intimidation. Karen's reign was over. The community could begin to heal. The weeks following the emergency HOA meeting brought changes to our neighborhood that no one could have predicted. The most immediate was a palpable sense of relief that spread through the community like a refreshing breeze after a long storm. People began to emerge from their homes more often, stopping to chat on sidewalks instead of hurrying past with averted eyes. The concrete changes came swiftly as well. True to Walter's word, Karen was formally removed from all positions of authority within the HOA. Her administrator access to the neighborhood Facebook group was revoked, and a committee of 3 rotating volunteers took over moderation duties. Posts that had mysteriously disappeared when I tried to defend myself now remained visible, and discussions became noticeably more civil and constructive. One morning, I found an official envelope in my mailbox. Not a violation notice this time, but a formal letter of apology from the HOA board. Dear Mr. Grant, on behalf of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, we extend our sincere apologies for the harassment and unjustified scrutiny you experienced. Our preliminary investigation has confirmed that the violation notices issued to your property were without merit and have been permanently removed from your record. We are committed to ensuring that such abuses of authority never occur again in our community. We appreciate your patience and courage in bringing these issues to light. The letter was signed by all 4 remaining board members. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but a significant acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done and the commitment to do better. 2 days later, another letter arrived, this one from my neighbors directly across the street, the Wilsons, who had been among those filming the night the police arrived. We are deeply sorry for not speaking up the night of the incident, they wrote. We witnessed what happened but remained silent out of fear of becoming Karen's next target. Your courage has shown us that staying silent only enables such behavior. Please accept our apology and know that you have allies on this street now. These gestures of reconciliation meant more to me than any public victory. They represented the rebuilding of community bonds that had been systematically damaged by years of fear and intimidation. The independent audit Walter had promised revealed the full extent of Karen's reign of terror. Over 3 years, she had issued more than 200 violation notices, 80% of which went to residents who had opposed her in some way. She had collected thousands of dollars in questionable fines, all of which were now being refunded. She had even maintained a secret problem residents list that included detailed personal information about neighbors she deemed uncooperative. The most significant change came at the next regular HOA meeting. With record attendance, the board unanimously passed what some residents jokingly called the Grant Amendment, a new bylaw that explicitly protected private driveways from any HOA interference. The rules stated clearly, private driveways are the exclusive domain of the homeowner. The association shall have no authority to dictate, suggest, or enforce how homeowners utilize their private driveways, provided no safety hazards are created. Life settled into a new normal. Neighbors began to introduce themselves, not just with cautious nods but with genuine interest. Community events that had previously been sparsely attended now drew crowds. There was laughter in the common areas, children playing more freely, a sense of shared ownership rather than top-down control. Through it all, my Jeep remained exactly where it had always been, parked in my driveway, symbolic of the stand that had started everything. No one even glanced at it sideways anymore. It was just a vehicle in its proper place, as it should have been all along. One evening, about a month after the meeting, I was out front tending to some newly planted flowers when a neighbor I had never spoken to approached hesitantly. She introduced herself as Alina, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Karen made my life miserable for years. My husband died 3 years ago, and I could not keep up with the yard work the way he used to. Instead of offering help, she sent me violation notices weekly. I was planning to move, to leave the home we had shared for decades because I could not bear the constant harassment." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Now, for the first time in years, I feel at peace here again. Young families on the block have offered to help with my yard. People wave and stop to chat. It feels like a community again, not a prison of rules and watching eyes." I heard similar stories over the following weeks, residents who had been silently suffering, afraid to speak up, now finding their voices and their sense of belonging again. Each story reinforced what I had come to understand. Standing up to bullies was not just about personal vindication, but about protecting the vulnerable and restoring what community truly meant. 6 weeks after the meeting, a "for sale" sign appeared in front of Karen's house. She had been notably absent from the neighborhood since the night of her public reckoning, reportedly staying with relatives in another town. The listing described the property as a must-sell, with "motivated seller, real estate code for someone desperate to move on." Karen never returned to clean out her house or say goodbye. A moving company came one weekend, loaded her belongings, and just like that, her physical presence was gone from our lives. There was no confrontation, no final showdown, just the quiet end of a chapter that had brought pain to so many. The new family that moved into Karen's house, a young couple with twin toddlers, knew nothing of the neighborhood's recent history. They were welcomed with a block party, something that had not happened in years. Watching neighbors bring food, offer help with moving, and genuinely connect with the newcomers, I realized how much had changed in such a short time. My own life settled into a peaceful rhythm. I formed genuine friendships with several neighbors, particularly Michael next door, who turned out to be an avid hiker like myself. The once threatening atmosphere of judgment and surveillance gave way to mutual respect and the comfortable knowledge that we were all just trying to live our lives in peace. Occasionally, I would receive an email or message from someone who had heard the parking story. It had apparently become something of a legend in HOA circles across the region. I never sought recognition for what had happened, but I did take quiet satisfaction in knowing that other neighborhoods might be inspired to examine their own power structures and stand up to similar abuses. 1 year to the day after Karen's late-night knock on my door, I sat on my front porch enjoying the evening air. My Jeep was parked exactly where it had been that night, a silent reminder of how a simple refusal to be bullied had cascaded into community-wide change. Children played freely on the street while parents chatted nearby. Elderly neighbors walked their dogs without anxiety. The atmosphere was relaxed, welcoming, alive. I sipped my coffee and reflected on the journey. What had begun as a defense of my private property rights had evolved into something much more significant: the reclamation of an entire community from fear and control. The simple act of saying no to unreasonable demands had rippled outward, giving others the courage to speak up, to reclaim their own voices and spaces. As the sun set over our neighborhood, genuinely ours now, not controlled by any single tyrant, I felt a deep sense of peace. My driveway was still my driveway. My Jeep was still my Jeep. But the victory had never really been about parking spaces or property lines. It had been about dignity, fairness, and the right of people to live without fear in their own homes. That was the true revenge, not driving Karen away, but building something better in her absence. A community where rules existed to protect, not punish. Where neighbors looked out for each other instead of spying on each other. Where differences were respected rather than policed. My driveway, my rules. But more importantly, our neighborhood, our community, our shared humanity. That was worth fighting for. And as I watched the neighbors gathering in the gentle evening light, laughing and connecting, I knew it had been worth every moment of the battle.